Imagine you go to work like any other day, but today someone dies. It's tragic, but this is a hospital. People die all the time. Then another patient dies, and another. You don't think much of it until someone checks the records. Every death happened on your shift, and just like that, you're now a suspect. Not just a suspect, but you are accused as a serial killer. This isn't fiction. This is exactly what happened to Lucia de Berk. Lucia de Berk was an ordinary nurse. She had a job, a routine, and a life that didn't involve being in the headlines. She worked at Juliana Children's Hospital in The Hague, a place where doctors and nurses dedicated themselves to caring for the sickest of the sick. Like any other hospital, death was a part of life. Premature babies, critically ill children, staff were no strangers to the hard reality of loss. But nothing could have prepared her for what would happen next. On the night of a routine shift, a baby named Amber passed away unexpectedly. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't even out of the ordinary. Premature babies, fragile and weak, don't always make it. But soon that death would trigger something far darker. It started with Amber, a fragile, premature infant. Her death was heartbreaking, but not unusual. The doctors had done everything they could, and the nurses, including Lucia, had been by her side in her final moments. No one questioned it. It was part of the job. It was part of the reality of working in a hospital. But then, a week later, another patient died. This time, it was an elderly woman in the geriatric ward, frail, battling multiple conditions. Again, no alarms were raised. She had been sick for a long time. Then it happened again. And again. A middle-aged man recovering from surgery went into sudden cardiac arrest. An 8-year-old girl admitted for a minor infection unexpectedly stopped breathing in the middle of the night. A premature baby, seemingly stable, passed away without warning. And in the background of every tragedy, Lucia was working. She was just there, on shift, following her routine, doing her job. But death was following her. At first, no one saw a connection. Death was always around in hospitals. It was something everyone learned to live with. The nurses comforted families, the doctors filled out death certificates, and then life moved on. But something wasn't right. Then came the cases that weren't just deaths. A patient, moments away from being discharged, suddenly collapsed, requiring emergency resuscitation. Another, stable for days, went into an unexplained coma. A third, whose condition had been improving, was found unconscious, her vitals dangerously low. These people didn't die, but they almost did. That's when someone started paying attention. A hospital statistician, buried in the routine task of reviewing patient data, noticed a pattern. A strange clustering of deaths and near-deaths. One name kept appearing in the reports: Lucia de Berk. The statistician didn't panic. Not yet. Hospitals had thousands of cases, and sometimes patterns appeared where none really existed. But just to be sure, he ran the numbers. He checked the records from the past year. Then he went back further. Every single time a patient had died under unexpected circumstances, Lucia had been there. 7 deaths, 3 unexplained resuscitations, all on her watch. He hesitated. Could this really be a coincidence? He recalculated, factored in more data, ran probability models. Then the final number came in. The odds of this happening naturally? 1 in 342 million. The probability was so small that, statistically speaking, it was considered impossible. The statistician had seen enough. He reported his findings. The hospital administration held an emergency meeting. The conclusion? If the numbers were correct, then Lucia de Berk wasn't just unlucky. She was a murderer. And now, they had to stop her before it happened again. At first, nothing changed. Not officially. There were no immediate suspensions, no police, no alarms. But Lucia could feel it. It started with the way people looked at her. Nurses who once greeted her warmly now avoided her eyes. Conversations that used to include her would suddenly stop when she entered the room. The once familiar hospital halls felt different, heavier, unwelcoming. Then came the whispers. She caught glimpses of them, colleagues leaning in close, speaking in hushed voices before falling silent as soon as she walked past. A glance over the shoulder. a hurried exit from the break room. The moment everything changed came on a cold Monday morning. Lucia arrived for her shift as usual, but this time there was someone waiting for her. A hospital administrator. Not in her office, not in a meeting room, but standing right there in the hallway, in front of everyone. "Lucia, can you come with me?" It wasn't a question, it was an order. The walk to the office felt like it took an eternity. The door closed behind her. A silence stretched between them. Then the words came. "There have been concerns." She frowned. "Concerns? About the number of deaths occurring during your shifts?" A pause. The words didn't make sense at first. She worked in a hospital. Death was part of the job. Why would her shifts be any different? "We've conducted a review of patient records," the administrator continued. "The results are highly unusual." Lucia felt a coldness creeping into her stomach. "What are you saying?" The administrator hesitated. Then, finally, the words that would change her life forever. "We believe you may be responsible for multiple patient deaths." Lucia barely remembered what happened after that. She heard words, but they felt distant. Statistical probability. Unexplained deaths. Ongoing investigation. She stared at them, unblinking, as the room closed in. Responsible for deaths. It was absurd. She had done nothing wrong. She had been doing her job. And now they were accusing her of murder. The formal suspension came within hours. Just like that, she was barred from entering the hospital. But it was too late to keep things quiet. The rumors had already spread. And by the time the hospital notified the police, the media had caught the scent of blood. And once the story got out, there was no stopping it. The moment the media got hold of the story, everything changed. Lucia de Berk was no longer just a suspended nurse under investigation. She was a serial killer. Soon it spread beyond the hospital walls, beyond The Hague, beyond the medical community. It became a national obsession. The newspapers ran with it. Instead of checking whether the deaths were actually suspicious, the media turned Lucia into the angel of death, a nurse who took lives instead of saving them. The face of a murderer lurking in plain sight, hiding behind a mask of compassion. Reporters camped outside her home, cameras flashing every time she stepped outside. She was no longer a person, she was a spectacle. News anchors dissected her every move, her demeanor, her past. They theorized about her methods, suggesting that she had poisoned patients, suffocated them, or tampered with their IVs. There was no proof of any of this, but proof didn't matter anymore. The public had already made up its mind. The world wanted a villain, and they had found one. The police took over the case, but there was a problem. A massive problem. There was no crime scene, no murder weapon, no poison, no forensic evidence. Not a single witness had ever seen Lucia harming a patient. And yet, she was already guilty in the eyes of the public. The prosecution knew this. So instead of investigating whether a crime had even been committed, they did something else. They worked backward. Instead of proving that patients had been murdered, they searched for past deaths that could be pinned on Lucia. The assumption was simple. If she had been a killer all along, there must be more victims. And so, they went digging. Every patient she had ever treated was now a potential case. Every natural death, every failed resuscitation, every loss of life on her shifts. Each one was pulled apart, examined, twisted into something sinister. The prosecutors didn't have to find evidence. They just had to create a pattern. And with the media already feeding the frenzy, it didn't take long for them to do exactly that. Then they found something even better than statistics. Lucia's diary. Like many nurses, she kept personal notes about her daily life. Entries filled with stress, exhaustion, the emotional toll of working in a hospital where death was an everyday occurrence. But the prosecution wasn't looking for context. They were looking for anything that sounded incriminating. And they found it. One sentence, buried among months of entries. "I'm starting to get used to death." To a jury, to the public, to a media that was already convinced she was guilty. It was a confession. It didn't matter that she had written it about her emotional state as a nurse, about witnessing death too often. It didn't matter that other nurses would have written the same thing. It was all they needed. Lucia wasn't just guilty, she was a psychopath. In 2003, Lucia walked into the courtroom to a scene straight out of a circus. A sea of cameras, journalists scribbling notes, spectators whispering. A public execution disguised as justice. Her lawyer was confident. The case was paper thin. There was no physical evidence, no direct cause of death linked to Lucia. This should have been an easy defense. But the prosecution had something stronger than evidence. They had fear. They didn't need to prove she was a killer. They just needed to make the jury believe it was highly likely she was. And what better way to do that than to put a number on it? A statistician took the stand. When asked about the probability of so many deaths incidentally occurred on Lucia's shifts, he didn't hesitate. The answer was already decided. 1 in 342 million. There was a shift in the air, a collective unease settling over the jurors. A number so impossibly large it left no room for doubt. And that was the prosecution's argument. If Lucia was innocent, the chance of this many deaths occurring on her watch was so incredibly low, so it must mean she was guilty. Lucia de Berk must have done it. When the jury left to deliberate, they were gone only for less than an hour. They returned with their verdict. Guilty. The judge handed down her sentence. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. In 2003, Lucia de Berk was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of 7 patients and attempted murder of 3 others. She became one of the most hated women in the Netherlands, despite the lack of physical evidence. Lucia de Berk had lost everything: her career, her reputation, her freedom. Convicted by a number, locked away by fear. She was placed in solitary confinement for months. Authorities claimed it was for her protection. But everyone knew the truth. Even inside prison, a child killer was the worst kind of criminal. Other inmates whispered her name with disgust. Guards treated her with silent judgment. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a monster. At least, that's what the world believed. At first, she tried to hold on to hope. Maybe there would be an appeal. Maybe someone would realize the mistake. But as days turned into months, and months into years, hope started to rot. But outside those prison walls, something was starting to shift. Slowly, quietly, a whisper of doubt. In 2006, 3 years after Lucia de Berk was convicted, a mathematician made a discovery that should have changed everything. The statistic that had sealed her fate, the infamous 1 in 342 million probability, was completely false. From the moment the trial began, the prosecution had relied on one simple argument. If Lucia was innocent, the chance of this many deaths occurring on her watch was so incredibly low, it must mean she was guilty. It sounded logical, it sounded scientific, but it was a lie. To understand the mistake, you first need to know what the statistician got wrong. The 1 in 342 million calculation was based on a dangerous assumption, that deaths in a hospital should be evenly distributed across all nurses and shifts. But hospitals don't work like that. Some departments see more deaths than others. Some nurses work in critical care, where survival rates are already lower. And Lucia? She worked in the highest risk areas of the hospital, the neonatal ward, the ICU, the geriatric unit, the places where patients were already the most vulnerable. If she worked in the most critical wards more often than other nurses, then it was expected that she would be present for more patient deaths. But the probability model completely ignored this. The prosecution made it sound like Lucia had been plucked at random from the entire hospital and just happened to be linked to deaths. In reality, she was working where death was more likely to happen. The second mistake was even worse. The statistician treated every shift as if it was an independent random event, as if nurses were assigned shifts in a perfectly even rotation, where everyone had the same exposure to high-risk patients. But that's not how shifts are scheduled in hospitals. Lucia wasn't randomly jumping from ward to ward. She had specialized experience in critical care units. That meant she was scheduled for more night shifts, more intensive care cases, and more fragile patients. If you spend more time with high-risk patients, you will naturally witness more deaths. That isn't suspicious. That's just statistics. But instead of factoring that into the probability model, they ignored it. The third mistake was how the data was selected in the first place. This wasn't a study conducted on all nurses from the beginning. The hospital didn't randomly check to see if any nurse had an unusual pattern. They only started looking at Lucia's shifts after baby Amber's death, after they had already decided she was suspicious. From there, they worked backward. Instead of asking, "Are these deaths truly abnormal?" they asked, "How many deaths can we connect to Lucia?" This is called confirmation bias, when you only look for evidence that supports a conclusion you've already decided on. The prosecution built a case by searching for deaths after labeling her guilty, and by doing so, they created a pattern that didn't actually exist. When experts reanalyzed the case using proper statistical methods, they found something shocking. The deaths that occurred on Lucia's shifts, they were completely normal. There was no anomaly, no impossible pattern, no statistical impossibility. The 1 in 342 million number was nonsense. The actual probability, when calculated correctly, was well within a normal range. But the damage was already done. The real question should have been simple. Were these deaths suspicious based on medical evidence? Instead, the prosecution asked something entirely different. What are the odds that Lucia was working during so many deaths? And by asking the wrong question, they convicted an innocent woman with bad math. Lucia de Berk didn't go to prison because of forensic proof. She didn't go to prison because of witness testimony. She went to prison because of a flawed calculation, a number that meant absolutely nothing, and no one questioned it. In 2008, a team of medical experts also took another look at Lucia's case, but this time they didn't care about probabilities, spreadsheets, or statistical models. They focused on the patients, the actual deaths, the medical evidence, and what they found shattered the entire foundation of the case. The first case they examined was baby Amber, the patient whose death had triggered the entire investigation, the moment that had turned Lucia from a nurse into a suspect. At Lucia's trial, the prosecution claimed that Amber had been poisoned. They never proved it, but that didn't matter. The accusation alone was enough. But now, in 2008, doctors finally did what should have been done from the very beginning. They retested the original medical samples. And the results? There was no poison. Baby Amber had died from a well-documented medical complication, a complication that had nothing to do with Lucia de Berk. The case should have ended right there, but it didn't. The medical team didn't stop with Amber. They went through every single patient death that had been linked to Lucia, and what they found was undeniable. None of them had been murdered. Every single death had a clear medical explanation. Some were premature babies who had developed fatal complications. Some were elderly patients with existing conditions. All had died of natural causes. Yet somehow, in 2003, none of this had mattered. The court had never demanded real proof of murder. They had only needed a pattern. But now, in 2008, the evidence was overwhelming. Lucia de Berk had never killed anyone. The final medical report was clear. The deaths were not suspicious. There was no foul play. There never had been. There had never been a murder. Not a single one. Even after the truth was uncovered, even after 2 separate investigations had proved her innocence, Lucia de Berk remained behind bars. Because even when the truth was staring them in the face, the justice system refused to admit it had been wrong. In any real criminal trial, the most important question should be simple. Did a crime actually happen? But in Lucia de Berk's case, this question was never asked. The prosecution never tried to prove that Lucia had harmed a single patient. Not one. To prosecutors, Lucia's presence was the crime. They treated it like a crime scene. But the real answer was simple. She worked a lot. She had experience in high-risk units, neonatal care, ICU, geriatric wards. She was assigned to the patients who were already the most fragile. If a patient's condition suddenly worsened, she was often the first nurse to respond, because that was her job. But the prosecution wasn't interested in that explanation. They already had their villain. And once they had her, everything else was twisted to fit that story. When they couldn't find forensic proof, they turned to her personal life. She wrote about her shifts, her stress, the emotional weight of watching patients die. But out of everything in that diary, prosecutors latched onto one sentence. "I'm starting to get used to death." They didn't care about the context, that she had written it about the emotional toll of losing patients. that any nurse working in an ICU or emergency ward would understand exactly what she meant. They took that line, ripped it from its meaning, and held it up in court as evidence of a cold, remorseless killer. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't proof of anything. But to the jury, it sounded like one. From the beginning, the prosecution didn't just argue that Lucia was guilty. They argued that she was evil. They called her cold and unemotional. They painted a picture of a woman who had no remorse, no grief, no sadness. But how was she supposed to act? She had been sitting in a courtroom for weeks, accused of killing people she had spent her life trying to save. If she cried, they would have said she was manipulating the jury. If she stayed calm, they said it was because she felt nothing. There was no right way for her to exist in that room. And the damage had already been done. The media had turned her into a monster before the trial even began. The public wanted someone to blame for the unexplained deaths. The jury felt the pressure. They didn't just see Lucia de Berk. They saw the angel of death. And when the verdict was handed down, it wasn't based on science. It wasn't based on facts. It was based on fear. By now, the evidence was overwhelming. The mathematical proof was undeniable. The medical facts had been re-examined. Every expert agreed Lucia's conviction was a mistake, but the justice system refused to admit it. Prosecutors fought back against her appeal. They argued that even if the probability model was flawed, Lucia was still suspicious. They tried to delay her case. They stalled her release. They knew she was innocent, but to set her free would mean admitting that they had stolen years of her life. For 2 more years, Lucia remained in prison, not because she was guilty, but because the system didn't want to admit it was wrong. By 2010, the pressure was too great. The case had drawn international attention. The scientific community was calling for her release. The world was watching. The Dutch Supreme Court had no choice. The evidence was too strong. The conviction was too flawed. The injustice was too massive. On April 14, 2010, Lucia de Berk's conviction was overturned. After 6 years of being called the Angel of Death, after 6 years of being branded a serial killer, Lucia walked free. When she left the courtroom, there were no celebrations, no apologies, no compensation. The same media that had turned her into a monster barely covered her release. The world had been so eager to believe she was guilty, but now that she was innocent, no one wanted to admit they had been wrong. Lucia de Berk had lost everything, her career, her reputation, 6 years of her life. But the people responsible, the prosecutors, the statisticians, the courts, they lost nothing. Lucia de Berk was free, but she would never get her life back. For 6 years, she had lived behind bars, labeled as one of the worst serial killers in Dutch history. The damage couldn't be undone. Lucia suffered from extreme PTSD. Even after being released, she struggled to trust people, to feel safe, to believe in justice. Her career was destroyed. No hospital would hire a nurse who had been falsely accused of killing patients. She had lost everything, and no one was held accountable. The real horror of Lucia's case wasn't just that she was wrongfully convicted. It was how easily it happened. Lucia de Berk wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a murderer. She was a nurse doing her job. But people couldn't accept that sometimes patients die unexpectedly. That tragedy doesn't always have a villain. So they created one. They took bad math and twisted statistics and turned them into proof. They took a personal diary entry and turned it into a confession. They took a woman dedicated to saving lives and turned her into a serial killer. Because that was the story people wanted to believe. Lucia de Berk was lucky, not because she was released, but because her case was re-examined at all. But how many others aren't so lucky? How many innocent people are sitting in prison right now because of bad science or false assumptions? How many lives have been ruined by public hysteria and media manipulation? How close was Lucia to being just another forgotten name in history? If the medical and statistical experts hadn't stepped in, would anyone has ever questioned the truth? This wasn't just a failure of the legal system. It was a failure of logic, of reason, of common sense. Lucia wasn't convicted by evidence. She was convicted by fear, by a society desperate for a villain. And that's what makes her case so terrifying. Because if a wrong number can destroy an innocent woman's life, if a misinterpreted diary entry can become a confession, if a public desperate for justice can ignore the truth, then this could happen again to anyone. Who will be next?